July 1948, the port of Buenos Aires. A middle-aged man walks down the gangway of an ocean liner. His suit is worn but neat. His papers identify him as Helmut Gregor, an Italian passport issued on the basis of an International Red Cross identity document. Everything checks out. The stamps are genuine. The procedure was followed by the book. The man's real name is Joseph Mengele. He is not the only one. Historians who have studied the archives of the International Red Cross and American counterintelligence estimate that hundreds of former members of the Nazi apparatus, from rank-and-file camp guards to organizers of the murder of millions, passed through similar routes in the first post-war years. This network had one common node, not an underground safe house, not an intelligence dead drop, an office in the heart of Rome, a short walk from St. Peter's Basilica. The document that opened the door to a new life in the decisive cases was signed not by a smuggler, not by an intelligence officer. It was signed by a bishop. His name was Alois Hudal. In this series, we'll examine the documented history, who he was, exactly how the system he built operated, who it demonstrably helped, and, just as important, what in this story is established fact and what remains a genuine dispute among historians, including the most uncomfortable question of all. What did the people above him, inside the Vatican, actually know? Let's start with who this man was before the war ended. Who was Alois Hudal? Alois Hudal was born in Graz, Austria, in 1885. He was ordained a priest, earned a doctorate in theology, and built a respectable academic career. By the early 1920s, he was teaching in Rome, and in 1923 he was appointed rector of the Pontificio Santa Maria dell'Anima, the historic German-Austrian church and college in the heart of the city, a position that gave him both prestige and a base of operations he would hold for over 3 decades. In 1933, he was consecrated titular bishop. This alone would make him an unremarkable figure in church administration. What sets Hudal apart is a position he took publicly in print years before the war, an open sympathy for National Socialism. In 1937, Hudal published a book, commonly translated as The Foundations of National Socialism, in which he argued that Catholicism and Nazism were not fundamentally incompatible and that the Church should seek accommodation with Hitler's movement rather than confrontation. The book was controversial even at the time. It drew criticism from other clergy and was placed under scrutiny, and it damaged Hudal's standing with parts of the Vatican hierarchy. This is not a matter of later interpretation, it's Hudal's own published position, on the record, before the war had even begun. Historians studying his correspondence and wartime conduct in Rome describe him as maintaining contacts with German military and SS circles throughout the occupation of the city between 1943 and 1944, a period that also saw the deportation of Rome's Jewish population. Some accounts credit him with occasional interventions to help individuals during the occupation. What is not in dispute is that by the war's end, Hudal held a rare combination: a senior clerical title, decades of standing in Rome, personal ties to figures in the German administration, and an already declared ideological sympathy that made him, of all people in the Vatican's orbit, uniquely willing to act once the war was lost. That combination did not stay theoretical for long, because what Hudal did after May 1945 was not improvised. He had, in effect, already told everyone where he stood, and now he had the opportunity to act on it.
The mechanics of the rat line. To understand how Hudal's network functioned, you have to understand a genuine, well-documented gap in the post-war bureaucracy. A gap that has nothing to do with conspiracy and everything to do with chaos. After 1945, occupied Germany and Austria had no functioning central government able to issue new passports.
The International Committee of the Red Cross stepped in to fill part of this vacuum, issuing travel documents to refugees and displaced persons so they could resettle. The application process required an applicant to establish their identity, and this is precisely the weak point historians point to. Verification relied heavily on supporting testimony, often from local clergy, parish records, or other displaced persons' documentation, rather than independent state records that, in the immediate post-war chaos, frequently didn't exist or couldn't be checked. This is where Hudal's position became operationally decisive. As rector of Santa Maria dell'Anima, he had standing to vouch for individuals, write supporting letters, and connect applicants to the Red Cross office in Rome and to South American consulates, chiefly Argentina's, that were at the time actively seeking immigrants and not rigorously screening for wartime conduct. Historians, including Gerald Steinacker and Uki Gonyi, who have worked extensively with Red Cross and Argentine archival material, describe this as the core mechanism, not a single unified conspiracy, but a convergence of a bureaucratic loophole, sympathetic clergy willing to exploit it, and destination countries willing to look the other way. It's important to be precise about what is and isn't established here. It is documented that Hudal personally intervened on behalf of specific individuals, writing letters, providing accommodation at the Anima, and facilitating introductions. It is also documented that the Red Cross issued travel documents based on insufficiently verified information, a failure the organization itself has acknowledged in later historical reviews. What remains genuinely disputed is the scale. Estimates of how many war criminals specifically, as opposed to ordinary refugees, passed through this general system vary widely between historians, and Hudal's own post-war boasting about the numbers he personally helped is treated by historians as unreliable. He had every incentive to exaggerate his own importance. What isn't in dispute is that this loophole, once it existed, was used, deliberately and repeatedly, by one bishop in Rome to move specific, identifiable men out of Europe. And one of the very first men to walk that route would go on to be responsible for the deaths of at least 900,000 people. The documented cases. Not every claim about Hudal's network rests on the same level of evidence. Some cases are confirmed by the perpetrators themselves under direct questioning decades later. Others are murkier, resting on secondary sources or later reconstruction. Here's what the record actually shows, case by case. Franz Stangl. This is the best documented case, and it comes from the man himself. Stangl had commanded the extermination camps at Sobibor and Treblinka, where several 100,000 people were murdered under his command. After the war, he was interned, escaped custody in 1948, and made his way to Rome, where, by his own detailed account, given decades later in a series of interviews with journalist Gita Sereni, he went directly to Bishop Hudal. Stangl described Hudal as expecting him, already aware of who he was, and arranging both his Red Cross passport under a false identity and his passage to Syria and later Brazil. Sereni's interviews with Stangl, conducted before his death in 1971, remain the single most direct first-person account connecting Hudal personally to a specific high-ranking perpetrator. Gustav Wagner. Stangl's deputy at Sobibor, responsible for the operational running of the camp's killing process, followed a similar path, fleeing to Rome and then to Brazil in the late 1940s. Historians studying the same Red Cross and Vatican-adjacent networks place Wagner's escape within the same general system Hudal facilitated, though the documentation of Hudal's personal, direct involvement in Wagner's specific case is thinner than in Stangl's. It rests more on the pattern of the network than on a first-person confession. Adolf Eichmann. This is where the record is genuinely less clear, and it's worth being precise rather than letting the most famous name in this story imply more certainty than exists. Eichmann did use false identity papers and did pass through Italy en route to Argentina in 1950. Some historians have placed his escape within the broader network of clergy-facilitated routes out of Italy. But the direct personal link between Eichmann and Hudal specifically, as opposed to other intermediaries and other sympathetic priests operating in the same general environment, is not established with the same first-person clarity as the Stangl case. Serious historians of this period are careful to distinguish part of the same general system from personally processed by Hudal, and the evidence for Eichmann sits closer to the former. What connects these cases isn't a single unbroken chain of Hudal personally handling every fugitive. It's that Hudal built and ran a specific mechanism: the letters, the Red Cross introductions, the practical logistics. And that mechanism is verifiably responsible for moving at least some of the most senior perpetrators of the Holocaust out of Europe and beyond the reach of the tribunals then underway in Nuremberg. Which raises the question the next section has to confront directly. Did Hudal see this as covert wrongdoing he was concealing, or as something he believed he had every right to do?
What Hudal himself knew and said. If there's one place where speculation isn't necessary, it's here, because Hudal didn't hide his motives. He wrote them down himself. In his memoirs, published in German after his death, under the title translating roughly to Roman Diaries, Hudal described his post-war assistance to former Nazis in explicit terms. He characterized it as an act of Christian charity toward men he believed were being unjustly persecuted by what he called the vengeful victor's justice of the Allied tribunals. He wrote of feeling it was his duty as a bishop to help former comrades in need, language that historians studying the text note draws no real distinction between ordinary soldiers and organizers of mass murder, a moral blurring that is itself one of the most cited pieces of evidence for how Hudal understood, or chose to understand, what he was doing. This matters for a specific reason. It removes any ambiguity about intent. Hudal was not a naive cleric unknowingly exploited by clever fugitives claiming false identities he had no way to question. By his own written account, he knew the general category of men he was helping, former SS and military personnel facing prosecution, and he framed helping them not as a secret to be ashamed of, but as a moral stance he was willing to put his name to in print. That distinction, known conduct openly rationalized after the fact versus a covert operation Hudal tried to conceal, is important for the next question this investigation has to ask. Because if Hudal wasn't hiding what he did, even boasting about it in his own memoirs, the harder question becomes, how much of this was known at the time by the people above him? What's proven and what remains disputed? This is the part of the story where it's easiest to overreach, so let's be exact about the difference between two separate claims: what Hudal did, which is documented, and what his superiors knew or approved, which is genuinely contested among historians. What's established? Hudal held an official Vatican title and a functioning institutional base, the rectorship of Santa Maria dell'Anima, for the entire period in question. He was not defrocked, formally censured, or stripped of his position during the years he was actively facilitating escapes. He continued to hold his post until 1952, when he retired under circumstances historians describe as connected to the growing scandal around his activities, though the Vatican did not issue a public condemnation at the time. That absence of formal contemporaneous sanction is itself a documented fact, not a theory. What's disputed? Whether Pope Pius XII or the Vatican Secretariat of State knew the specific scale and nature of what Hudal was doing, and whether they tacitly approved it, were deceived by him, or simply failed to investigate, is a question historians answer differently based on the same underlying archive. One school of interpretation, represented by historians like Michael Feyer,
argues that Pius XII's broader wartime and post-war anti-communism created an institutional climate where aiding anti-communist Germans, including former Nazis, was seen by parts of the church hierarchy as strategically useful against the Soviet Union, making the Vatican's silence about Hudal's activities plausibly a matter of tolerance rather than ignorance. Other historians, including some who have reviewed the Pius XII archives opened by the Vatican in 2020, caution that the Vatican was not a single decision-making entity. It was a large bureaucracy in which Hudal operated with real autonomy, and that direct evidence of personal authorization from Pius XII himself for Hudal's specific escape network has not been found in the material reviewed so far. Some researchers argue the more accurate description is institutional negligence and a wartime culture of not asking questions, rather than deliberate, coordinated concealment from the top. It's worth being honest about the limits here. The 2020 archive opening is still being worked through by researchers, and conclusions are actively being revised as more material is published. Any claim of certainty in either direction, total papal ignorance or direct papal approval, currently outruns what the documentary record actually supports. What can be said without overreaching? A bishop operating openly, using his official position, ran an escape network for at least a decade, was allowed to keep his post throughout, and no institutional intervention stopped him until public scandal made his position untenable. Whether that reflects deliberate cover or bureaucratic failure is the real, unresolved historical debate, and it's one worth taking seriously precisely because the answer isn't obvious.
The Reckoning and the Record. For decades after Hudal's death in 1963, his role remained known mostly to specialists, a footnote in Holocaust history rather than a widely told story. That changed gradually through a combination of investigative journalism, court testimony, and eventually the deliberate opening of church archives. Gitta Sereni's interviews with Franz Stangl, published in her 1974 book Into That Darkness, were the first major public account to place Hudal directly at the center of a specific escape, in the perpetrator's own words. Through the 1980s and 1990s, as researchers including Uki Gogni gained access to Argentine immigration and police archives, the broader pattern connecting Hudal's network to the country's post-war immigration policy became clearer, showing that Argentina's government under Juan Perón was not merely a passive destination, but had, in some documented cases, actively facilitated entry for former Nazis. The most significant recent development came in 2020, when Pope Francis ordered the opening of the Vatican's Pius XII-era archives to researchers, decades earlier than the standard 70-year rule would have allowed. This gave historians direct access to Secretariat of State correspondence and related files for the first time. Early findings from historians working with this material have added detail and nuance to the Hudal case, but have not, as of the material reviewed so far, produced a single document showing direct personal authorization from Pius XII for Hudal's operation, reinforcing rather than resolving the debate covered in the previous section. What the archive opening has done is shift the historical conversation from speculation to evidence-based argument. Researchers are no longer debating whether Hudal's network existed. That was established decades ago. They're now working, document by document, through the harder question of institutional responsibility above him. There's a temptation, in a story like this, to end on outrage, to point at an institution and declare it guilty. But the more honest and, frankly, more useful conclusion is a quieter one. Alois Hudal was not a secret double agent, not a lone conspirator operating in the shadows. He was a bishop who, in plain sight, using an official title the Church never revoked while he held it, built a functioning pipeline that moved some of the 20th century's worst perpetrators beyond the reach of justice, and who, when he later wrote about it himself,
felt no need to disguise his reasoning because he believed he had been right. That's arguably the most unsettling part of this story. Not that a system was exploited by clever criminals evading detection, but that a person with real institutional standing looked at mass murderers and decided, openly, that helping them escape accountability was a moral good. The failure here wasn't only in the loopholes of a broken post-war bureaucracy. It was in the fact that an individual with genuine authority chose, deliberately, and without much need for concealment, to use that authority this way, and that no one with more authority than him stopped it for years. The question this leaves us with isn't really about Hudal. It's about every institution, then and now, that gives individuals real power and then doesn't ask hard enough questions about how they're using it, until a scandal, or a historian, or an archive finally forces the question into the open.